Now what we've got here is a Sherman, but it's modified into a crab flail. It works on a fairly simple basis. There's a drive shaft coming out the side of the tank behind me, going up the front here into a bevel box, and then driving the rotor. That works a series of chains which thrash the ground as it goes along, and the idea is that the chains detonate mines. Now this is quite an interesting vehicle because there have been flails since the Battle of Alamein, but they'd all relied on a separate engine to drive the flail. And the great thing about the Crab, what made it outstanding in a way, was the fact that the engine of the tank, which in this case is a Chrysler multibank, was driving the flail. So it drove the tank and the flail at the same time. It didn't matter too much because the idea was that when the tank was flailing, it was travelling about 1.5 miles an hour. So it didn't need the extra engine power that you'd need if you were going faster. But in addition, there's a number of things on this flail. One of them is this serrated wheel at each end of the drum, which was designed to cut its way through barbed wire. The idea was that if you weren't using it as a flail, you could actually lower the boom down almost to the ground and it would dig its own way through obstacles and that kind of thing. I don't think they ever used it for that, but that's what it could do. But it was a flail, it was very effective. It worked about 90% going across the field. The only trouble was if it arrived at a humpy piece of field and there was a mine hidden in a hollow bit of ground, this flail missed it. And that's why they later came up with what they called a contouring flail, but they left that so late that the war was over by the time it was ready. But this is a basic Sherman. In fact, as I said, it's the Chrysler multibank Sherman, and you can always tell them it's an M4A4, or Sherman 5 it will be in British service, and you can always tell them by the wider spacing of the wheels. That's because the tank itself is a wee bit longer because it's got a larger engine in it. The Chrysler multibank is worth looking at in its own right. It's 5 6-cylinder engines, so it comes out as a 30-cylinder engine, all clustered round a central crankcase, and it really is quite an impressive thing to look at. The Americans wouldn't touch it. They used it as a training tank only, but for some obscure reason, being British, the British liked it, and we got a lot of M4A4s and used them very effectively. The Sherman Fireflies M4A4 as well. But that's the idea of the flail. Now, as I say, they had been earlier versions of it. In the desert, they'd started out as Scorpions, and usually based on a Matilda, with the engine in a box on the side, and they had to find some poor idiot who'd prepared to sit in the box with the engine while the thing was going along, which wasn't really all that clever. Later on, in Britain, they started developing flails. They started them on the Matilda again, and later they did them on the Valentine. There was a thing called the Scorpion, and then there was a Sherman with a turret replaced, in fact, with a motor system, which was called the Marquis, I think. And that worked just like a flail. In fact, it used the same boom. But none of them, apart from this one, drove the flail from the tank's own engine, and that made a tremendous difference. It made them eligible to go in a landing craft to start off with. So on D-Day they were immensely effective. But what they found on D-Day was that where the Crabs had landed, because they had a 75mm gun, they actually found the gun very useful to deal with enemies in dugouts and that kind of thing. So they kept it going from that reason with the gun mounted in the turret, but it had to reverse the turret when it started flailing because the two were incompatible, because so much muck was thrown up and so many clouds of dust whipped up by these chains whizzing round that they tended to keep the gun and anything vulnerable like the sights were kept out the way of the dust, and that at least was the idea. If you look at the type of chain which is used here, it's not just chain. It's actually a sort of riveted and welded construction. It's a series of long metal loops which they found twisted but didn't break, because when the mine goes off, the whole jib raises up in the air and falls back down again. and you could get these mine chains ripped off. And in fact, a tank would only run for so long before it lost its chains and had to go away until they could be replaced. It carries loose chains in case they're needed to replace any that have been destroyed, and that's why it was done. The actual idea driving the flail is said to have been invented by a chap called Rackham. Now, Rackham had been a tank corps officer in the First World War. He was famed as a bus designer, and he worked for AEC in Walthamstow in London, and he was the man who invented the flail. Most of the others were, as I say, driven by separate engines, although they did have one which they called the Pram Scorpion, and that involved the tank pushing ahead of itself the flail on a separate undercarriage. And even that, although it worked fairly well, they found was a little bit cumbersome. And this method of putting the boom attached to the tank permanently was probably the cleverest of all. There were 3 regiments, all of the Royal Armoured Corps, making up 30th Armour Brigade, and that was controlled by a chap called Brigadier General Duncan, who, when I first came here, was the actual curator of the museum, and he ran the flails because one of the things with 79th Armoured Division, which you'll see is marked on the front of the tank here with their badge, 79th Armoured Division were quite happy to lend tanks out to various units to clear mines and do that kind of thing. They were even loaned to the Americans on more than one occasion, but they didn't like them staying away. So 79th Armoured Division appointed a man to represent them at the headquarters of whatever tank regiment was using them, or whatever division was using them, and he would make sure that the minute these tanks had stopped doing what they'd been taken in to do, in this case clearing mines, they had to be taken straight back to 79th Armoured Division and not used for anything else, because left to their own devices, commanders of the division in question would use the flails as ordinary gun tanks, which they didn't like at all. They'll clear any type of mine, from anti-personnel mines to anti-tank mines. The only drawback, of course, is that every now and again they'll miss one. Germans tried having a mine attached to usually an aerial bomb, both buried underground, and the idea was that the tank would advance, would blow up the mine, that would automatically detonate the bomb and blow up the tank. That was one of their little wheezes they came up with to keep going for a while. But they were immensely effective, probably the most effective method of clearing mines, but in many ways this is one of the most useful vehicles that the 79th Armoured Division fielded during the Second World War.